Kevin Raposo here with SpeedyPhotographer.com, and in this video we're going to be reviewing the brand new Sony ZV-E10. Now this review is based on the same system I used in some of my other comparison videos, and all of the concepts and times that I'll be referencing are up on screen. Now full disclaimer before you jump in, I am not reviewing the kit lens as part of this video. I am specifically looking at the functionality of the camera body itself. So do I recommend buying the Sony ZV-E10? Well, let's jump in and find out. So let me start by giving you some context. This review is not just a 15-minute list of features. I need to explain why I bought this camera, who will benefit from it, and how it compares to other cameras in the market. The ZV-E10 is a new camera line from Sony targeting beginners and video content creators. It's the successor to the ZV-1 that came out in May of 2020. The design and internal components of the ZV-E10 are very similar to the A6000 series that you might be familiar with, aside from a few photography features that have been stripped down. And this is very important to understand because the A6400, A6500, and A6600 are all very popular with YouTubers. I see a lot of content being shot on those three cameras. Even for myself over the past year, I recorded every single tutorial video on this YouTube channel and inside my course with a Sony A6500 and a Sigma 16mm f1.4 lens. But there have always been three key issues with this setup for me. Number one, the weight. An A6500 paired with a Sigma 16mm f1.4 lens comes in at just under 2 pounds, which is slightly too heavy for most entry-level gimbals. Now at the time of making this video in November of 2021, the Matza Mini P is one of the cheapest options that can actually balance this camera and lens combination, but it comes in at $250 US. Issue number two for me has been the real-time battery charge. You can plug in a micro USB cable to charge the A6500 while you're using it, but the charge speed is extremely slow and it only adds about a half hour of recording time in 4K. And issue number three has been the autofocus. The only camera in the A6000 series to include IAF is the A6600. And again, at the time of making this video, the A6600 is by far the most expensive option, coming in at $1398 US. But as I plan to cover in this review, the ZV-E10 can resolve all three of these issues while offering a set of features that are pretty much unmatched by any other camera body at this price point. And to help explain how, I'm going to be drawing a number of comparisons to the A6000 series, as well as the older ZV-1 to help you understand the gap that this camera can fill. Which leads us to the first category in this review, the price. At the time of making this video, again in November of 2021, the ZV-E10 retails at $698 US for the body only, or $798 US with the 16 to 50mm kit lens. Now just to give you some perspective, the launch price of the A6400 was $898 US, the A6500 was $1398 US, and the A6600 was and still is $1398 US as well. So the ZV-E10 is cheaper than every single one of those cameras, but is it worth the cost? Only you can decide based on the rest of this review. Now let's jump into the next section, which is the design and the ergonomics. The ZV-E10 has a very similar design to other crop sensor cameras that have been released by Sony, with one big exception. There is no viewfinder. Now this is a clear indication that the ZV-E10 is not really targeting photographers. It includes a lot of photography features that I plan to talk about later, but if your only plan is to shoot still pictures, then the lack of a viewfinder is probably a deal breaker for you. But of course, removing the viewfinder does come with a lot of benefits for video content creators. As a result of this decision, the ZV-E10 is smaller than my hand, and it's smaller than any of the cameras in the A6000 series, full dimensions up on screen. Not only that, but the ZV-E10 only weighs 343 grams. Just to give you some perspective, the A6600 is 503 grams, which makes it a lot harder to balance on a cheaper gimbal. Now aside from that, the ZV-E10 includes a pretty standard Sony button layout with the addition of a zoom rocker around the shutter button, allowing you to control the focal length of any motorized zoom lens. Now just a quick note here, you're probably going to want to disable the rocker in the menu if you're using an incompatible lens, otherwise you're going to get this annoying error message every single time that you touch it. Now in terms of the ergonomics, I will say that I find the hand grip is way too small and pretty uncomfortable to hold. I can only assume that this was an intentional decision by Sony because again, the ZV-E10 is not really targeting photographers. And the build quality of this camera is not exactly impressive either. The cheap door that's covering the connection ports feels like it's easy to break, and the plastic behind the LCD screen doesn't seem like it can hold up to wear and tear. And big surprise, you also get no weather sealing. With all of that said, this is a cheaper camera body, and I really didn't expect much in this category. Next up, we have the sensor, and this category will be pretty quick. The ZV-E10 was designed with the same sensor used in the A6000 series, which means that you get APS-C with the 1.5x crop factor and around 13.6 stops of dynamic range. And now we can move on to the lens mount. The ZV-E10 includes the standard Sony E mount, which means that you can use interchangeable removable lenses. And this is probably the most significant upgrade from the ZV-E1, which had a non-removable 2.7x optical zoom lens, the equivalent of about a 24 to 70mm focal length. Now, Sony's decision to include this E-mount is, in my opinion, an amazing choice. Instead of another pocket camera that ends up being compared to an iPhone, you get a much more professional camera that could theoretically be used with top-of-the-line lenses. And this is why the target market of this camera has expanded to include content creators like me. I would never consider buying the ZV-E1, but you can bet that I definitely jumped on the ZV-E10. Moving on to the LCD screen. The ZV-E10 includes a 3-inch, fully articulating LCD screen. Now, this is a huge upgrade from the A6000 series, which only included tilting or flipping screens, and it makes vlogging so much easier. But there is a catch. All of the camera connection ports are directly behind the LCD screen. So if you have anything plugged in and you try to rotate the screen, it's going to get stuck unless you turn it inward first. On top of this, your view of the screen is going to be partially obstructed by any of the cables that you plug in. I shoot most of my tutorials with my camera sitting on a tripod and tethered to my laptop, so this is definitely something that annoys me, but I don't think it's a deal breaker. Next up, we can talk about the photo functionality. Now, when it comes to photography, the ZV-E10 can shoot 24.2 megapixel raw images at up to 11 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 8 frames per second with the electronic shutter. You also get a couple of nice bonus features like a panorama mode and an interval shooting mode for time lapses. Now, like I said, photography is not the primary focus of this camera, but the functionality I just mentioned is more than enough for content creators to shoot thumbnails for YouTube or even just to snap some higher quality pictures without needing a lot of gear. Moving on to the video functionality. The ZV-E10 can shoot in 1080p at up to 120 frames per second or in 4K at 100 megabits and 24 frames per second. You can even record proxy files that can be linked up for video editing, which was a nice surprise for me to discover. The 4K footage itself is extremely sharp thanks to that oversampled sensor, very similar to what the A6000 series cameras have always been doing. And when it comes to some of the actual features, Sony did not hold back. You get zebras, you get focus peaking, and more importantly, you get S-Log2 and S-Log3. A couple of other things worth mentioning: the ZV-E10 has a tally light on the front of the camera, a huge dedicated record button on the top of the camera, and the LCD screen will even light up with the red border while you're shooting. It is almost impossible to forget to hit record. Also worth mentioning is the dedicated background blur button. This can automatically toggle between shooting at f8 and shooting at the lowest possible aperture your lens can handle, which creates a shallow depth of field. You might think this feature is only for beginners, but to be honest, I actually find it really convenient when I'm shooting stuff on location. In any case, next up, we have the audio functionality. Now, most cameras this small do not record good audio internally, but Sony has tried to improve on that here. The ZV-E10 includes a 3-capsule directional microphone at the top of the camera, and it also comes packaged with a wind filter. Now, this is the benefit of not having a viewfinder. It frees up space for all this audio hardware. So to help you judge for yourself, let me share a few audio samples with you. I even shot a short clip with a different camera for comparison. Testing 1, 2, 3. This audio is being recorded with the Sony ZV-E10. Testing 1, 2, 3. This audio is being recorded with the Canon R6. Testing 1, 2, 3. This audio is being recorded with the VideoMic Pro. The results of this test were pretty obvious. The ZV-E10 definitely outperformed my R6, and I think it would be great for vlogging, but obviously it still pales in comparison to my dedicated Rode VideoMic Pro. There is also one other very important audio feature that I have to mention in this section, which is that the accessory shoe works as a digital audio interface. This means you could theoretically slide in something like the Sony XLR K3M and record XLR audio input from an external microphone. So we're about halfway through this review, and if you find this helpful so far, please remember to like and subscribe to my channel. It would be greatly appreciated. Next up, let's take a look at the autofocus system. Now, the ZV-E10 effectively includes the exact same autofocus system found in the A6600 for only half the price. Specifically, you get 425 phase detection and contrast detection autofocus points, covering 84% of the entire frame. That means the camera can track your subject almost anywhere in the shot. The autofocus also works reasonably well in low light, rated for -2 EV. Most importantly here though, you get real-time IAF tracking, and it works extremely well. You can see that the camera accurately tracks my eyes as I move around the frame in this sample clip, keeping me in focus the entire time. This was something I really wished I had when I was shooting with the A6500, but I do need to point out that there are a few limitations. I found that if you turn on proxy recording while shooting in 4K, or you do any anything that involves tethering the camera to your computer in 4K, IAF is disabled completely, and I assume this is because of processing power limitations. Last but not least, the ZV-E10 also includes a product showcase mode, which is specifically targeted for content creators who need to hold something up in front of their face. You can see when I turn this feature on that product showcase mode is much more responsive and quicker to lock in focus. Next up, we have the low light performance. Now, Sony is well known for offering some of the best low light performance in the industry, and that is no exception again with the ZV-E10. You can see during this test that everything from ISO 100 to ISO 1600 looks pretty much identical. You start to notice a bit of noise creeping in around ISO 3200, and it becomes much more obvious at ISO 6400. ISO 12800 is probably the furthest I would ever push the ZV-E10, but just so you can have a look, this is what ISO 25600 looks like, and then here's ISO 32000, which is where the camera tops out. Now, just to give you a point of comparison, you can see that ISO 12800 on the ZV-E10 compares pretty well with the same thing on my Canon R6, which is a full frame camera that costs about 3 times more. So the ZV-E10 is punching well above its weight class in the low light category. Moving on to the rolling shutter, and in this category there is nothing good to report. The rolling shutter on the ZV-E10 is absolutely horrible because it continues to use the same sensor found in the A6000 series. Definitely do not plan for any quick movements with this camera. Next, we have the electronic image stabilization, which works pretty well in my testing. Have a look at this sample. This is me vlogging with image stabilization turned off. This is me vlogging with image stabilization turned on. These are both clips side by side. Now, as you can see, electronic image stabilization does crop in a little bit because the camera is essentially recording a smaller area of the sensor and then adjusting that area based on your movement. But if you use a wider lens, you should find this works extremely well for vlogging without any significant quality loss. Next thing on the list is the memory card. The ZV-E10 includes a single UHS-1 SD card slot with a theoretical write speed of 104 megabytes per second. I personally use the SanDisk Extreme Pro card with a 95 megabyte per second write speed, and it works perfectly. Now, considering how similar the ZV-E10 is to the A6000 series, I was not surprised to find that the memory card slot continues to be in the worst imaginable position, which is underneath the camera next to the battery. This design is terrible, and it probably is my least favorite thing about the ZV-E10 because I have to physically remove the camera from my tripod or my gimbal every time I finish shooting and want to switch cards. And speaking of the battery, this leads nicely into the battery life. The ZV-E10 uses the same NP-FW50 battery found in the A6000 series, which is infamous for having horrible battery life. And in my brief testing, that trend has not changed. You only get about 80 minutes of recording time or about 400 pictures. However, there has been a massive improvement to the real-time charging speed of this camera. If I connect the ZV-E10 to an external power source using the USB-C port, I can pull up to 5 hours of recording time in 4K before the camera will actually shut off. This is a massive improvement over my old A6500, which could only last for 2 hours even while it was connected to external power. Now, in my testing, I found that the ZV-E10 is drawing a lot more power from my battery pack than the A6500 ever did, which explains that dramatic difference. Which means that I'm actually very happy about the battery life because I almost always keep this camera tethered to external power. On to the next category, reliability and overheating. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed. After the way that I described the build quality earlier in this review, you might think that the ZV-E10 is unreliable, but I promise that is not the case. My ZV-E10 has never overheated and never had a single hiccup in over 2 months of continuous use, both indoor and outdoor under the sun. And as many of you already know, I shoot a lot of long form content and tutorials for my full course, Speedy Photographer. Just make sure to set the overheating threshold in the menu system to high, and you should be good to go. Last but not least, let me talk about the connection options. The ZV-E10 includes a USB-C port, a micro HDMI port, a headphone jack, and a microphone jack, all on the left-hand side of the camera. Now, the USB-C port can be used to connect the camera to your computer as a webcam, for live streaming, or even to be used with the Imaging Edge software for full remote control over your settings. I personally use this software all the time when I'm shooting my tutorial videos. I should also mention that the USB-C port doubles as the charging port because the ZV-E10 does not come packaged with an external charger. As for the micro HDMI port, it can output clean 4K video with 422 sampling, perfect for external recording. And finally, in terms of wireless connectivity, the camera has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but honestly, I never bother with these features unless I need to transfer pictures to my phone for immediate delivery. Alright, so we've reached the end of this review. Time to answer the most important question. Would I recommend buying the Sony ZV-E10? And my answer is yes, but you need to make sure you identify exactly what you plan to use this camera for. I've said it a lot throughout this review, but the ZV-E10 has a very specific target market. If you're a complete beginner interested in video, or you're a vlogger, or you're a content creator, you're probably going to be happy if you buy this camera. It comes loaded with features and performance performance that is unmatched at this price point. But if you are none of these things, my answer is a definite no, especially if you're a photographer. If your goal is to take pictures and do nothing else, do not buy this camera. You need something with a viewfinder because the LCD screen alone does not cut it. I hope you found this helpful, and if you're a new photographer or content creator looking for tutorial content just like this, head over to SpeedyPhotographer.com. This is my online photography school teaching you everything from how your camera works to how you can grow your business and land your first clients. I consistently receive great comments about the quality and the value of my tutorials. I even offer a free hour of training that gives you a sneak peek at the content inside the course, link in the description below. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.